Hi, I'm Heather Staines, one of the Charleston Conference directors and a senior consultant at Delta Think. Thank you for joining us for our Charleston leadership interview. Today we have with us Frances Pinter. Frances keynoted the virtual conference in the fall of 2025, and she's here today with us to tell us a little bit more about her story. Welcome, Frances.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, let's kick off with a brief introduction for folks who were not able to join us for the virtual keynote back in the fall, and then we'll kick off with more questions.
Okay. Well, I've been in academic publishing for over half a century. I've worked for large companies, small companies. I've worked for nonprofits and for-profits. I've worked for NGOs, but it's always been around academic publishing. And at the moment, I'm working on helping Ukrainian publishers uh, through SUPRR, which stands for Supporting Ukrainian Publishing Resilience and Recovery. And I'm a visiting fellow at the School of Advanced Study at the University of London.
Great, thank you so much. So, one of the things I've always found, incredibly interesting about your story is that you started a publishing house while you were still working on your PhD. And as someone who's done a PhD, I can't even imagine, how you had the bandwidth to do that. But can you tell us a little bit about how that happened and how through that process you ended up focusing on young authors that really had new things to say and new underdeveloped fields?
Sure. So I was 23 and I was having lunch in the London School of Economics senior common room, which was very exciting. And I was meeting up with a man who was a Ugandan Asian academic. He was from Kampala, but he was finishing his PhD at Harvard. Now, at the time, Ugandan Asians were scapegoated by the dictator Idi Amin, who'd crashed the economy, and he threw them all out. They were expelled. And so this young man found himself suddenly in a refugee center in London with his parents and siblings. So I suggested that he write a short book on his experiences. But he said he didn't know how to do that and he didn't know how to find a publisher. So, kind of on the spur of the moment, I said, I'll set up a publishing company to publish your book. So, within 3 weeks, he wrote the book, and in 3 weeks, I set up the company. And 3 months later, we published a book called From Citizen to Refugee, which was his story. Now, against all odds, all odds, this became a success. It even got reviewed in the London Sunday Times. Can you imagine? Well, then many years after I published the book, an Indian filmmaker stumbled upon it and decided she just had to meet the author. They met, they fell in love, they had a son, and that son is now mayor of New York City, Zoran Mamdani.
That's amazing. Amazing.
Publishers sometimes have a very curious role in matchmaking. But I thought to myself at the time, this is very cool. When the book came out, maybe I should be a publisher. But I really didn't have any idea what I wanted to do. So in those days, if you wanted to go into publishing, especially as a woman, you became somebody's secretary, endlessly typing on manual typewriters. This did not appeal to me at all. So back to your question, why young authors? Well, at the time, I was hanging out with young academics who were trying out new ideas and willing to take a chance with a very small young publisher. The second book I published was called War Without Weapons. And this came out of a stable of young people who were creating a new field called peace and conflict research. Now, I always carried a copy of my printed, very small catalog around with me, even on vacation. And one day I was climbing around on the Matterhorn in Switzerland, and I met a radical scholar in linguistics who was challenging everything that had come before. And he went on to edit a series for me. And the thrill of just meeting people who challenged conventional wisdom, that stayed with me throughout my career.
Mm. Well, knowing you, Frances, as I have now for some time, I am not surprised at all that you were always on. So, so thinking about, those early fields that you focus on in publishing, one was innovation in tech. And, this was kind of, early time to be looking at that. And, you not just published on it, but you kind of lived it. Tell us about your early work in networking a computer system, and how that went on to serve as a model for others.
Okay, a little bit of background to that. I grew up in the United States, and my father worked on the lunar module. That was the thing that took men to the moon. Both my parents were engineers, and I was just hopeless in science, but I loved innovation, and I could see what was being taken from the space industry. Um, so, as far back as the late 70s, I started a list on innovation, science, and society, which was, again, a new field then. And in the early 80s, Pinter Publishers, my little company, was strong enough to move into some very nice offices in Covent Garden in London. I shared a floor and a receptionist with my husband, who was running an innovative film production company. I can tell you, at home, we talked about metadata for years. And if you think publishing metadata is complex, try film. Anyway, back to your question. Being married to a film guy meant that I was wedded to Apple, all Apple products. It's also my technical department at home. So I called Apple and said to them what I wanted. I wanted computers on movable trolleys. I wanted anyone in the company to have access to the same stuff anywhere in the office. But I couldn't afford a computer for every single person in the office. One for every two people would probably be enough, because so much was still being worked on by hand and by paper. So Apple networked us up with an Ethernet network socket arrangement through the floors underneath the desks. And this gave us maximum flexibility as to where the computers could be used in the office. That's what networking meant in those days. I was told by Apple that this same system had just been introduced to Gatwick Airport on a similar system. So I told my publisher friends about this, and suddenly publishers started flocking over to my offices in Covent Garden to have a look how this was
Mhm.
done.
I can imagine gaggles of sightseeing publishers coming in. I started my career in publishing in the late 90s, and not even everyone at the office had internet access, because the thinking was people would just play on their computers all day. Honestly, there wasn't that much you could do online in those days, or I'm sure we probably would have. Um, One of the other things that's really important to me is industry service. And I know that over your career, you've served on, many industry committees. Why is that so important to you? What has it taught you? And do you advise others to get involved in this way as well?
Well, absolutely, yes, get involved. In the early days in my career, I was flattered to be invited and sometimes even elected to various committees and councils. Uh, but back then, I was still feeling, well, I'm a token young woman more than anyone who could contribute. But I learned a lot on these committees, and I was able to figure out how my little company fitted into the larger scheme of things and how the industry itself was organized. And being active in the industry led to all sorts of other good things. By the late 80s, I was chosen to lead a trade delegation to Japan and South Korea. Uh, this was something that came about by accident. Alex Macmillan was then chair of Macmillan and the grandson of Harold Macmillan, and he was supposed to lead the delegation to Japan and Korea. But he fell ill just before we were supposed to go. So the CEO of the Publishers Association called me on a Friday afternoon just before the Tuesday departure date and said they had a problem. I was technically the second most senior person on the delegation because I was the only other head of company. Small company, but still head of the company. But they weren't sure they could send a young woman as a delegation leader, and they would try and find somebody else who was perhaps in retirement, who could be wheeled in to lead the delegation. Well, I was pretty indignant about this and said, it's 2:30 now. You have until 5:30 to decide if you want me to lead the delegation because I have to clear my weekend and prepare for that. And about 5:15, he called back and said, yes, the seniors of the Publishers Association decided to take a risk, a gamble of me leading the delegation.
Yeah. I'm surprised you gave them 3 hours, but anyway.
Well, this led to more delegations, including to China, which was then only just opening up, and invitations came in then to speak at conferences in places like Singapore and Malaysia. I even built in a wonderful opportunity to go paragliding around the island of Penang. But fast forward, look, now there are many more opportunities on how to learn on the way up. Eventually, as I grew older and more experienced, I realized I could give back to the industry through some of these committees. And I think a lot of our industry people are happy to give their time for the good of the industry, much like librarians also do so. And I really think that this kind of service fosters trust between people of our profession, which is just so incredibly important. And I think it's really quite special in this scholarly communications ecosystem. I don't see it in all professions. It really is something that is ours to cherish.
Mm. I love that about our industry. You've mentioned, quite a number of international places so far, which kind of highlights for me that really from the beginning of your career, from the beginning of your life, or from the beginning of your career, as we've talked today, you've had a very international approach and outlook. Was that just naturally, or how did that come about, that international approach?
Well, for a start, I was born in Venezuela of Hungarian parents and lived on 4 continents by the time I was 20. So I guess that had something to do with my interests and my studies. My PhD was in international relations. But I also saw something else. I saw my father's work on space travel, and I watched how Soviet and American scientists were actually able to collaborate quietly and calmly, even during the Cold War. And that really intrigued me. That was one thing that influenced me, but then there were others. About halfway through my career, I had an amazing interlude of nearly 10 years in the 90s working as the publishing director for the Open Society Institute, that it's now called Open Society Foundations. And my remit was to cover all 30 of the post-communist countries. And it was at that time that I set up the Central European University Press in their new university in Budapest. But what had the broadest impact was the work of the Center for Publishing Development, which I also established. its mission was to help develop the new independent publishing companies that were springing up all over the place. And I brought home some really useful experiences of working within very different types of business cultures. And I also saw some shocking scars left from the days of complete totalitarian control of access to knowledge.
Certainly gives one pause today here in society. On the publishing side, in the early days of digitization, when we did our planning call for this, you mentioned what I thought was just a fascinating story. You were at Bloomsbury Academic at the time, and you actually won a contract against many big players to digitize the Winston Churchill archives. Can you tell us about that story and how that evolved?
Sure. As you know, Heather, I was hired as the founding publisher for Bloomsbury Academic way back in late 2008. We were barely up and running in 2010 when we saw a tender for digitizing and publishing the Winston Churchill archives, which are held in Cambridge. Now, most people would not have thought that the publishers of Harry Potter would ever be taken seriously. How could we convince the trustees and the Churchill family that we could do the job? Remember, Bloomsbury Academic hardly existed at all at the time. But somehow we ended up on the very short list of 2 publishers invited to present to the board in Cambridge. The format was pretty strict, I have to say. We were given 15 minutes for presentation and 15 minutes for questions. And I wondered, how would they select, giving us such a short amount of time? But I assembled my team and we worked out a strategy. And I put together supplementary materials on memory sticks, one for each trustee. We actually took the same train from London to Cambridge with our friendly competitors. They too had a team of 4. Interesting. And one was carrying an overflowing cardboard box of printed promotion materials for their existing range of books and journals. Waiting in the lobby for the presentations to begin, I got my anxious team together and I held up a very small bag, which was carrying about a dozen memory sticks. And I pointed at the scruffy-looking cardboard box of our venerable rival and said to my team, "Relax, we've won. It's in the bag." And I held up something like this, where I had my memory sticks. Now, the trustees then decided we were hungry enough as newcomers to give the project our all, and we did.
I just love that story. I remember when we called them memory sticks too. I'm feeling as you described that, like I could use a memory stick for my daily life these days.
I
Now,
still take conferences, by the way. If I go to a conference and I have to rely on somebody to put my slides up, I have them on a stick.
You don't still carry around that printed catalog that you used to carry around, do you?
Nobody prints a catalog anymore.
Maybe it's on the memory stick as well. Now, one of the things that kind of brought us together in the industry was open access. And I know you've had a very long standing interest in open access. And increasingly today, conversations about open access are in the global context and, the areas of like equity and just broader than the publishing context specifically. Tell us about open access and how that played out in one of the areas that you had an early focus on in Africa.
Well, that was an interesting piece of serendipity too. So I think it was around 2005. Someone called Larry Lessig phoned me. He was a law professor then at Stanford, and he was one of the founders of the Creative Commons license. And he wanted to know whether there was a way of territorially limiting a CC license to Africa only for architectural drawings only. Well, this may seem like an odd question now, but you have to remember that the idea of CC licenses were first developed for musicians wanting to share their compositions for mix and remix use. And so some of these questions were only being addressed in the first few years that the licenses were available. Well, later on, I did do some work in Africa, not long after that meeting with Larry. And I was trying to understand how local content could become open access in a continent that had really lousy internet connections. I was fascinated by the challenges and the opportunities in applying the CC licenses, and particularly their potential to empower local scholars and students. So my curiosity led me to a small number of people who were trying to promote free access to academic and educational content online in Africa, but they didn't have a business model for this. And that led to a grant from IDRC of Canada that enabled us to run a small pilot project, set of projects in South Africa and Uganda. And it was early days for really understanding how to license copyrighted content for OA with all the ramifications around commercial, non-commercial use and derivative uses, and how the licenses would even stand up in court, because nobody knew yet. So that was a very interesting time in Africa. And my Bloomsbury days actually came right after this work in Africa. And it was there that I wanted to try out Creative Commons licensing for monographs with a British publisher. And actually, it was Richard Sharkin who was there and said, okay, let's have a go. And ultimately, Knowledge Unlatched, which I launched as a separate entity in 2012, was developed as a collective funding scheme to make books open access. And so all of this was influenced by that first experience with a hands-on project in Africa.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for reminding us that things like Creative Commons licenses that we might take for granted today didn't always exist and wasn't always clear how they would move forward. And I love the connection with Richard, who has spoken at a plenary at previous Charleston conference. So folks who are interested in learning more about Richard's experience can take a look back at that. I always like to ask the folks that I interview as part of these interview series what role librarians have played in their professional life. Have librarians played a role in yours?
Well, I just love that question, Heather. I could spend hours talking about that, but I won't. I will restrict myself to just a few minutes. So librarians have always educated me. I remember a long time ago in the 80s, being the only publisher representative on the MARC Users Group Committee. And this was when MARC was very young. And for the first few meetings, I really struggled to understand what was going on. I just couldn't grasp the conversation. And then a very young Lynn Brindley, who was later CEO of the British Library, took me aside and gave me a quick terminology translation course. For example, the word currency for librarians meant how up to date a book record was, while for me, I'd be thinking about dollar-pound exchange rates. So it really took me a while to catch on. Another thing that sticks into my mind, another person, is and Peters early in the 2000s. She was head of both the library and the computer departments in the prestigious Institute of Education in London. And she made me appreciate just how intertwined librarianship and computing had become. And of course, this is very relevant today. And then later, after that, before I even had a name for Knowledge Unlatched, and it was just an idea that I was talking about, Robert Darnton of Harvard Library hosted a workshop for me to bring together some of the most distinguished thought leaders of the time. And the support for this collective funding solution was forthcoming from some really inspirational librarians like the late Anne Wolpert of MIT and Winston Tabb from Johns Hopkins. They really got it before many in the publishing community did. And while many of my publishing colleagues were still skeptical.
I feel you as a non-librarian on the being almost bilingual to understand what's happening, and I need that language translation support in a lot of the boards and committees that I participate in. What advice, if there's folks out there who are earlier in their careers, would you give who might be thinking about some of the things you've said today to give them ideas to where to go next?
Well, the first thing that I would recommend is that they do a lot of daydreaming. Think about our wonderful industry and what you can contribute to making the world a better place, and what role you can contribute to that endeavor. You can't change the world on your own, but get together with our industry to do our bit. I'd also suggest that young people learn something about how other industries operate and are adapting to changes and challenges, especially AI. Look horizontally and see where are the ideas from elsewhere that can help you with your work. I would say test new ideas on your boss to show how clever you are, but gently and diplomatically. And mix with your peers, learn from each other. I didn't have that when I started out doing everything myself. I wish I had. Good idea to talk to them.
I love that. And, also test out ideas on your junior colleagues. I think these days, there's really have their fingers on the pulse. They're following different streams and developments that might not be, at the forefront always of our attention. They know what the cool things are that are coming up. So share that information, I think at every level. That's wonderful. Now, as we've heard today, and as we heard in your wonderful keynote back in November, you've accomplished many things across your ziggity zaggity career. That's how I refer to mine, and hopefully that's can be seen as a good thing. Do you have any idea of maybe how you might like to be remembered?
Well, succinctly, I'd like my epitaph to say, she made things happen. One of the nicest things someone said about me was, she's a mentor and a maverick. It may have been the other way around, a maverick and a mentor. Not quite sure, but both terms, I hope, describe me, and I hope I'll be remembered in both senses. But more importantly, I'd like to think that the universal commitment to sustainable, equitable, and open academic publishing becomes and remains the norm, something in which I played a very small role in making it happen.
I'm sure that's going to be the case, and I look forward to see all the wonderful things that you're continuing to make happen in your busy life. Thank you for sharing this time with us today, for joining us for this interview, and we look forward to crossing paths with you in the future.
Me too. Thank you so much. Really nice to talk to you.